Okay, let's unpack this. If you're an active woman, maybe training for something, hitting the gym, or just, staying fit, you definitely know your body changes throughout the month.
Hmm.
And you've probably wondered, could my nutrition strategy actually make a difference depending on where I am in my cycle?
Right.
Today, we're diving deep into exactly that question. We're pulling insights from a critical review published back in 2021.
Yeah, in the International Journal of Environmental Research and Public Health, it basically synthesized findings from 23 different studies.
Okay.
And our mission here really is to figure out what this collection of research tells us about how diet, maybe supplements, might be used to potentially optimize performance or manage exercise impacts across the cycle.
And just as importantly, we need to shine a light on where the major gaps in our knowledge still are, because this is a massively important area for you, the listener.
Absolutely. The context here is huge. I mean,
Mhm.
think about it. Female participation in sports and exercise has just exploded globally.
It really has.
Yet, when you look at the sheer volume of research focused on optimizing performance, especially research that actually considers the nuances of the menstrual cycle,
Right.
well, it's still lagging behind studies focused on men.
Right.
And the core challenge the research faces is the menstrual cycle itself. Your cycle involves fluctuating levels of key hormones, primarily estrogen and progesterone.
Hmm.
These shifts can influence various physiological factors, like your metabolism, how your body handles fluids, even your body temperature.
So historically, researchers often just tested women in one phase
Yeah,
to avoid that variability.
exactly. Usually the early follicular phase, that's right at the start of your cycle when hormone levels are relatively low and stable.
Yeah.
They do it precisely to avoid that hormonal variability.
Which, okay, I get it from a research design perspective, wanting to control variable.
Sure.
But the consequence for you, the listener, is that performance recommendations based only on data from that tiny window, they're inherently limited. You're training and living across your entire cycle.
Absolutely. And the review highlighted something pretty stark. Nearly 40% of surveyed women who exercise regularly feel their cycle negatively impacts their training or performance.
Wow, 40%. That really underscores the need for this research.
It does. And these hormonal changes, especially in the luteal phase when both estrogen and progesterone are higher, are thought to influence things like thermoregulation, how your body holds on to fluid, your blood volume.
Even sweat rate, you mentioned.
Yeah, even your sweat rate. Some studies suggest your sweat rate actually increases in the luteal phase compared to the follicular phase.
Okay, so we've set the stage. Cycle matters, research is playing catch up, we're using this 2021 review. Let's jump into what the studies actually found. Starting with hydration. We all know that's fundamental.
Definitely. Losing even just 2% of your body weight through sweat can really hurt performance.
Yes, yeah.
So the review looked at findings from 11 studies focused specifically on hydration. But it's important to note right away, many of these were conducted primarily or even exclusively in the follicular phase.
Okay, same pattern. So within that follicular phase window, what looked promising for hydration?
Carbohydrate electrolyte solutions, CES,
Right,
typical sports drinks with fuel and salts.
right.
Solutions around 6% carbohydrate content specifically showed some benefits. One study found a CES improved running time to exhaustion by a pretty significant 16% in recreational athletes.
15%.
Yeah, during their follicular phase. Another one saw a 3.7% faster time in a 21-kilometer time trial for experienced runners using a CES, again, follicular phase.
That's a decent improvement, especially for endurance. Did the review mention anything about adding protein to those drinks? I feel like that comes up sometimes.
It did. Interestingly, one study noted that adding protein to a CES actually seemed to reduce its performance-enhancing effect in the follicular phase.
Ah, that's a bit counterintuitive, isn't it?
It is, based on some other sports nutrition ideas. Needs more looking into for sure.
Okay. Any other interesting hydration findings from that follicular phase research?
Deep ocean mineral water got a mention in one study.
Really? What does it do?
It seemed to help improve peak torque, basically, how much rotational force your muscles can generate. And it also sped up the restoration of saliva osmolality.
Which is a marker for hydration balance.
Exactly. It helped rebalance the water and salt concentration in saliva faster.
What about carb mouth rinses? Just swishing, not swallowing.
Yeah, those. The results were a bit mixed in the follicular phase studies reviewed.
Mixed how?
Well, one study on runners didn't see a significant boost in endurance performance. But another study, this one with participants who weren't endurance trained, found it reduced their perceived exertion, how hard it felt.
Okay, so maybe more mental.
Possibly. And it also improved reaction time in that group.
Yeah.
So it may be more of a cognitive benefit than direct endurance, at least in the follicular phase context they studied.
And just plain electrolytes, like
Yeah.
pickle juice or sodium phosphate tablets.
The studies the review looked at focusing on standalone electrolytes in the follicular phase. They didn't really consistently show clear improvements in fluid restoration markers or things like aerobic or anaerobic thresholds.
Okay, so a lot of that is follicular phase data. What happens when studies did look at the luteal phase? Was there anything?
Well, what's fascinating here is there was a study testing water ingestion during soccer drills, specifically in the luteal phase.
Yay.
And while drinking water led to some positive physiological signs, like feeling less tired, lower blood lactate.
So good signs.
Good signs, yeah. But the actual improvement in performance time on a passing test was pretty small. It didn't reach statistical significance.
So body felt better, maybe, but didn't translate strongly to that specific skill test.
Right. In that particular study, anyway.
Was there any study that actually compared a CES across phases?
Yes, there was one. It tested a CES in both the late follicular and the mid-luteal phases.
And what did they find comparing the two?
Interestingly, they found no significant difference between the phases when it came to electrolyte restoration or fluid balance outcomes.
Even though women tend to retain more fluid in the luteal phase?
Exactly. Despite that underlying physiological difference, the outcomes of the CES were similar in both phases in that study.
Okay, so pulling this hydration section together, what's the main takeaway from the review?
It tells us that carbohydrate electrolyte solutions, CES, they show promise, particularly for aerobic performance. But based on these studies, the strongest evidence is really concentrated in the follicular phase.
Right.
How effective they are and exactly what your fluid or electrolyte needs might be in the luteal phase.
Yeah.
That's much less clear.
And the review speculated why that might be.
Yeah, they mentioned maybe progesterone's effect on things like gut permeability in the luteal phase could potentially hinder how well you absorb a CES, but that's just speculation at this point.
Definitely needs more research comparing across phases then.
Absolutely.
Okay, let's shift gears. Micronutrients. The review highlighted iron and calcium.
Right, just 2 studies included in this category.
Iron's a big one for athletes, isn't it? Energy, endurance, recovery.
Hugely important. And we know iron status, like serum iron levels, tends to be lowest during menstruation.
So what did the iron study in the review find?
It was quite impactful, actually. They looked at iron supplementation 50 milligrams twice daily for 6 weeks in female endurance rowers. These rowers had low iron stores, but weren't technically anemic yet.
Okay, so iron depleted.
Right, and the supplementation showed significant benefits. It improved their energy efficiency by 1.3% during a 4-kilometer time trial.
Meaning they used less energy for the same work.
Exactly, which is a big deal for endurance. It also boosted their absolute VO2 peak, their max oxygen use capacity, and their maximal work rate. Plus, it reduced their overall energy expenditure and maximal blood lactate.
That sounds like a solid set of improvements. Did the cycle phase matter in that study? They tracked it daily, you said?
They did. And they reported that in the context of this specific study and intervention, menstrual status did not significantly affect the improvement seen, not in the iron group, nor in the placebo group.
Interesting. So the benefit seemed independent of phase in that case.
In that specific study, yes. It connects back to the bigger picture. Iron is just crucial for carrying oxygen and for mitochondrial function, your cell's energy factories, both vital for aerobic performance.
Right.
And the review also noted, as an aside, that things like using oral contraceptives can actually increase serum iron levels.
So the need for supplementation might vary depending on factors like that too.
Exactly, it's individual.
Okay, what about calcium? We know it's key for bone health, preventing stress fractures, especially relevant if energy availability is low sometimes.
Right. The key finding here came from a study on trained female cyclists. They found that a single pre-exercise meal that was high in calcium, about 1,350 milligrams, which is way over the typical daily recommendation.
Okay, a big dose before exercise.
Yeah. That meal reduced exercise-induced bone resorption markers. These are substances in your blood that indicate bone tissue is breaking down.
So less bone breakdown after exercise.
Exactly, which you generally want to minimize.
And the study was designed to include women across different phases.
It was. They balanced participants across follicular and luteal phases. And the findings suggested that this positive effect of calcium on reducing bone breakdown markers might work pretty consistently, regardless of the hormonal shifts across the cycle.
That does raise an interesting question then. Could timing your calcium intake, maybe specifically around workouts, be a strategy?
It's a really interesting thought. The review noted the calcium meal also reduced parathyroid hormone, which is involved in calcium regulation. Adding more weight to the idea, it has a direct effect on bone metabolism around exercise.
Fascinating. Okay, now, let's get into the phytochemicals and omega-3s. You said this is where it gets really interesting.
Yeah, this segment covered 10 studies in the review, and the findings are quite diverse. Some promising, some inconsistent, some just surprising.
Let's start with the obvious one, caffeine, known performance enhancer.
Right, a classic ergogenic aid. The review summarized findings from several studies.
And crucially, did any of these actually look across different cycle phases?
Yes, some did. And one significant finding was that caffeine, typically around 3 milligrams per kilogram of body weight.
Okay, standard sort of dose.
Yeah. It increased anaerobic cycling power performance by nearly 2% across all three phases tested in that particular study. Early follicular, pre-ovulatory, around ovulation, and mid-luteal.
Wow, okay, so that suggests a pretty consistent power boost from caffeine regardless of where you are in your cycle, for that type of exercise anyway.
That study's findings definitely point that way for anaerobic power. Now, another study looked at strength velocity, how fast you can move a weight during half squats.
Different measure.
Different measure. Caffeine increased this speed in the early and late follicular phases, but the effect wasn't statistically significant in the mid-luteal phase in that study.
Huh. So raw power might be consistent, but the speed component of strength might vary more depending on the phase.
It's possible. Suggests things might be a bit more nuanced than just caffeine works.
Any other caffeine takeaways?
Well, in the luteal phase specifically, another study found caffeine increased maximal fat oxidation fat burning by nearly 32% during exercise.
32%. That's a lot.
It is. And it also reduced perceived exertion in that same study. Oh, and interestingly, one study found combining caffeine with sodium phosphate improved sprint performance in the follicular phase, even when caffeine alone didn't show a significant effect in that specific context.
Okay, so pulling the caffeine thread looks like a strong candidate for boosting anaerobic power fairly consistently across phases. Might be nuances for strength speed, and a clear benefit for fat burning in the luteal phase. Mechanism might be related to calcium release in muscles.
That's the theory mentioned, yeah. Helping with muscle contraction.
Okay, moving on. Anthocyanins. These are compounds in dark fruits.
Exactly. Found in things like blackcurrants, tart cherries, often studied for anti-inflammatory, antioxidant effect.
Blackcurrant extract came up.
It did. Studies showed it enhanced fat oxidation during submaximal exercise by about 18 to 27%. And this was seen in both mid-luteal and follicular phases tested.
So another fat oxidation benefit across phases tested.
Right, without affecting oxygen uptake. The review did mention some details, like a potential dose-response plateau, and that effects on actual 5K running performance varied based on runner speed or training load.
And did phase matter much there?
One study recorded menstrual phase had only a minor influence, but didn't really detail the significance, so a bit unclear.
Okay. What about Montmorency tart cherry concentrate? Popular for recovery.
Right. That study didn't find an effect on sprint times, but it did seem to improve muscle recovery and reduce perceived muscle soreness after tough exercise, helped restore muscle function faster.
Was that phase specific?
Not really compared across phases. It was tested either in the early mid-luteal phase or just before a withdrawal bleed for those on contraception. So promising for recovery, but we can't say much about phase differences from this review.
Got it. Beetroot juice. Nitrates for blood flow.
One study looked at it in the follicular phase, found it did not significantly improve sprintability in the way they tested it.
Okay. And finally, fish oil. Omega-3s. Usually studied for reducing muscle damage and soreness, right?
Usually, yes. But this is where there was that really surprising finding I mentioned earlier.
Ah, right. What was it again?
One study using fish oil supplementation, and it was a very high dose. The review notes 960% and 720% of daily recommended values for EPA and DHA.
Whoa, okay, megadose.
Megadose. It actually increased perceived muscle soreness by about 38% compared to placebo.
Increased soreness.
Increased it. And this was seen consistently in both the mid-follicular and mid-luteal phases they tested.
That is completely the opposite of what you'd expect, especially since, didn't you say the study showed it increased estrogen levels? Which should theoretically protect against damage.
Exactly. It's very counterintuitive.
Yeah.
And it definitely highlights inconsistency with some of the research suggesting fish oil might help soreness. Shows how complex these interactions are and may be dose-dependent or context-dependent.
Wow. Okay, so wrapping up this phytochemical section, Caffeine looks pretty solid for power across phases, maybe some nuance with speed. Blackcurrant helps fat oxidation. Tart cherry for recovery. Beetroot juice, maybe less impactful for sprints in that test. And fish oil. Well, that's a puzzling one regarding soreness in this study.
Yeah, definitely a mixed bag, and the influence of menstrual phase seems to vary quite a bit depending on the specific compound and outcome.
Okay, so we've covered a lot. Hydration, micronutrients, these phytochemicals, and omega-3s. Let's try to pull it all together. What does this mean for you, the listener, trying to navigate performance nutrition? So what's here, keeping all those limitations in mind?
Well, despite that huge caveat, the lack of studies comparing interventions across all phases, we can still pull out some potentially promising leads based on where they were actually tested.
Right, so based on the review, if we look purely at the follicular phase studies.
Carbohydrate electrolyte solutions, the CES drinks, showed benefits for endurance, and blackcurrant extract looked good for enhancing fat oxidation.
Okay, and if we look at studies focused on the luteal phase.
Montmorency tart cherry concentrate showed promise for improving recovery, and caffeine showed potential for boosting fat oxidation and likely power output based on the multi-phase study.
And importantly, those few interventions that were tested and compared across multiple phases, they give us crucial starting points, even if the picture isn't simple.
Exactly. Caffeine seemed to give a fairly consistent boost to power and strength where tested, maybe with that velocity nuance.
Right.
Calcium consistently showed that positive influence on bone markers across phases. And even the fish oil study, despite the weird soreness result, gave us data showing a similar, though unexpected effect across both phases tested.
But this just brings us right back to the elephant in the room, the biggest limitation the review hammers home.
Which is that so many potentially promising things, CES for performance, blackcurrant, tart cherry, have only been rigorously tested in one specific menstrual phase in the studies reviewed here.
Which means we honestly just don't know if the different hormonal environment of other phases would change how effective they are.
We don't. We can guess, but we don't have the data from this review.
And that makes the urgency for more research just incredibly clear. More women are active than ever. We need to understand how the cycle influences performance and recovery.
And how nutrition can be strategically used throughout the entire cycle, not just studied in that convenient early follicular window.
Did the review suggest specific future directions?
Yeah, it called for more interdisciplinary research designed specifically to compare outcomes across different menstrual phases. Also, digging into the specific biological mechanisms like how exactly does progesterone affect gut absorption, or estrogen influence blood vessel dilation or muscle contraction, and also considering how common conditions like painful periods, dysmenorrhea, might interact with nutrition and performance.
So connecting this back directly to you, the listener, this knowledge, even with all its gaps, is still powerful, right?
Absolutely. Understanding what might work and when, based on the best available research, even if limited, it empowers you to make more informed choices. Maybe experiment intelligently with your own nutrition and hydration.
And it really reinforces the importance of an individualized approach. Paying attention to your own cycle, how it affects your training, and how your body responds.
Exactly. Self-awareness is key while the research catches up.
So to quickly recap then, this deep dive into the review shows nutrition interventions definitely hold potential to enhance performance and recovery in women.
But it also strongly suggests their effectiveness could very well depend on which phase of the menstrual cycle you're in.
And while we have some promising leads, CES, blackcurrant, maybe in follicular, tart cherry caffeine and luteal, caffeine and calcium looking more consistent across phases tested.
The overwhelming conclusion is that the lack of robust, multi-phase studies comparing these things head-to-head across the entire cycle is a massive gap in our knowledge.
Which leaves us with a final thought to maybe chew on. Just how much more potential could female athletes unlock? How much better could performance and recovery be if we had truly comprehensive, cycle-specific nutrition guidance based on research that actually tracked women through all phases?
Yeah, it's a big question. Until that research exists, really understand your own cycle, maybe using insights like these as a starting point for careful personalization.
Yeah.
Well, that's the essential first step.